Hey everyone, welcome to the program, WRSA Radio. I am your host, Grenadier One. As always, I hope you are having a good week. It is almost that time. Christmas and New Year's are upon us. I hope you all have a great holiday season. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you and yours. It promises to be, I don't know what it's going to bring. Over the years, I think many of us had made predictions. Some of them didn't come to pass, but many have. We've just been way off on the timing of when those things would happen. So I think this year coming, we will prove to be pivotal in our time, and many of the things we foresaw, well, maybe back 8, 10, 15 years ago, well, they're going to begin to happen. I don't know, but I do know, what I do know is that we can learn a lot about the future by studying the past. So that's what we're going to do today, as well as the episode next week. This week's show is part of an interview I did last Friday with Karl Dahl, author of the book Faction, as well as a new book coming out very soon that I will leave that to him, let him tell you all about it, because it's fantastic in this interview. This is great stuff, and we talked for quite some time, so I'm going to cut this into a two-parter and post the conclusion next week for the show. So, well, basically, I'm being lazy somewhat. I guess I did all the work last week, but I'm gonna cut it into two parts so that I can spend time with my family next week, and I don't have to worry about trying to put a show together for you guys. But I can still maintain the regular scheduled programming that you guys have come to enjoy and expect from WRSA Radio. I hope you enjoy it and you listen to the second part next week, because this is fantastic stuff. And the material will be on the final exam. So here we go. Welcome, Karl, to the show. I glad to have you back. It's been a good while. What have you been up to?
Hey, thanks for having me. Well, what have I been up to? I have been wrapping up, and I just spoke with one of my proofreaders, like literally 20 minutes ago, about my next book, which is going to be Faction with the Crusaders, which is a prequel to the previous book that I put out, Faction. It's about Joseph Shea, who's the patriarch of the Shea kind of spy biz, and his entry into the business of espionage during the Spanish Civil War.
Gotcha. That sounds terribly interesting, so I'm looking forward to that. You want to go into a little bit more about it, or just leave it all for the readers? Or
yeah, sure. So I can, why did I write this?
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of writers. I guess today everybody writes with the idea that, well, I'm going to do another book, so everything's kind of left open. Did you have that in mind when you wrote Faction, the first novel?
I didn't. Let me kind of step back. When I wrote Faction 1, it was because I have been writing for a very long time, and it was a story I had to get out. Gotcha. It's certainly not autobiographical by any means, but it kind of touches on a lot of scenarios that I saw around me that could have played out, especially in the 90s. And I really wanted to talk about kind of the America and the path that we've been on and how we got where we're at, because a lot of the time people don't think about those things. They have a idealized image of it, and that rarely comports with reality. So I wanted to kind of talk about some things. I had the benefit of growing up with a lot of really interesting people, whether people are directly in my family or friends and associates. And so there's been some some people involved in the spooky world around me, and just spending time with them and talking about it and reading about it. There's a lot of really interesting stories that are much more interesting than the average, like, corny spy thriller sort of thing, which is, a mile wide and an inch deep. Nothing to those kinds of things. So I really wanted to dig into that. It was also kind of it was written in kind of an experimental fashion. I was really strongly inspired by guys like Matt Bracken, a great writer. You can see his evolution as a writer, and what he does with his stories, going, from his original Enemies, Foreign and Domestic series all the way up to where he's at now, and kind of giving the reader guides to how they could respond to certain scenarios in their own lives.
Right.
And so I kind of wanted to play on that. And that was one of the things that I think people who got Faction picked up on right away, is there's a narrative, but there's something else going on where it's fairly instructional. And the prequel is a little different than that. It's much more of a straightforward fictional narrative, and more traditional in terms of the way that it's communicated. Although it has, I tell the story in a interesting time flow, because I jump right into action that takes place like from a timeline much later in the war. Mm-hmm. And then you start all over and see how we got there. And these threads kind of weave together, and until the rest of the last half of the book is just a straight line. Right. From about 1938 to about early 1941. Gotcha. With the story of Joseph Shea going through the war and then post-war, because when you engage in covert operations or engagement in foreign wars and serving in a foreign army, it's rarely straightforward. There's all kinds of legal ramifications. And then depending on how official or unofficial you were, because as people may or may not know, the United States did not have official foreign intelligence agencies at the time. It was all unofficial. It was done through like William Donovan's network, who he bumps into, because the timeline lines up, who went on to create the OSS, but it took some doing to get there. There was a joint American and British kind of casual intelligence network associated with business leaders, as well as journalists and some press syndicates. And that's how our character ends up in it, because as a young man in the hinterlands of the Pacific Northwest, he decides that he wants a life of action and adventure, and decides to go to Europe to become a reporter, just so that he can travel and see some cool stuff in the early 1930s before everything really heats up.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was I'm getting another phone call. There we go. All right, sorry about that.
No worries.
I was getting beeps on the line there. Yeah, that's fascinating. I know, back to the OSS, or the pre-OSS, a lot of people don't know that prior to that, most of our foreign intelligence was done by the Secret Service.
Yep.
And so that's in fact, there's a lot of really, really interesting stories that go along with that, and people who may have been agents of the Secret Service that we know in history as other things, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. One of them may have been a Secret Service agent. So there's a lot of really hidden history there. It's a fascinating topic, and things that a writer could explore in that way.
And now things are so formal and official, but I mean, the United States Army was tiny,
right.
before World War One and after World War One, right? Like the army essentially dissolved at some point in 1919, and it's interesting because so William Donovan shows up in this story because, and it kind of happened coincidentally because I placed my character in a certain time and place after the big action of the story wraps up, because there's this period in the Spanish Civil War where the nationalist army, the good guys, have completely crushed the quote unquote Republican army in Catalonia, around Barcelona, right. Their easternmost flank, the way that they were feeding in from France, equipment and people going back and forth. And they're just preparing for the march on Madrid, and then capturing some other areas like Valencia. And because it had been a meat grinder of a war. And so that's one of the themes, is that people are disposable in this. And Francisco Franco, one of the ways that he reconciled all the various disparate, like, rightist groups that had to be consolidated into a single thing, is by treating all the zealots as shock troops. Right. And so they took massive casualties, so that the people that were left were those that were completely under the authority of, the Nationalist Army Command, and were just on with the program. They weren't an extremist of any kind. And this also was his way of reducing the trouble that they would have with the Republicans, because they generally adopted a policy that if you were literally just a person who voted libtard, or you were a conscript in the army and you didn't do anything horrible, like you didn't participate in massacres, you weren't committing atrocities behind the lines, etc., that you would essentially be put into a work camp and vetted to make sure that you are who you say you are and you weren't involved in these things. And then they would generally be released, or a lot of times brought into the Nationalist Army.
Right. And
everyone else needed to be ground to dust. And so the meat grinder approach to the war, there was a lot of complaints by the Germans and the Italians, and then other Spanish factions, that they felt like the war could have been ended decisively, and that wasn't the plan. That wasn't what Franco wanted to do. He wanted to grind up all the potential future enemies, and it worked very well, because they then had decades and decades of peace. You can talk about what happened later, but that's a topic for another time. Yeah, and so there's this period. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, those are perfectly reasonable policies too. Honestly,
exactly.
It's a very, very pragmatic approach to things. I mean, you can just look at our Civil War of we never really reconciled that, and we're dealing with the downstream consequences of that. 100 and whatever years later. So it's very interesting way of going about it.
And it's funny because the way I would put it as a caveat to that comment, which I agree with, is that when it came to the Western settlement, that became like a heat sink for a lot of the tensions there for a couple generations, right? Like, there's Reconstruction, and there's the way that Southern veterans were treated in that context, right? Mm-hmm. But if they went west, it was a totally different situation. And in fact, I have a ancestor who was a a Yankee cavalryman who co-founded a town with other veterans of the war, and half of them had been Confederates.
Right.
And they had no issues whatsoever because they were all on the same page. And in fact, they would, on the 4th of July, they would have the Confederate veterans and their families picnic, and then the Union veterans and their families picnic, and then they would all get together for the big town celebration.
Right.
And so that was, 1880s, and later. And so that's one way to kind of reconcile it, is to say, well, we're all on the same team now as long as you accomplish this goal that we have, which is go over there and, subdue the land. So in Spain, the war had a couple of kind of convulsions, and maybe I should step back and talk about a basic timeline. So a qualifier that I'll add is that so the novel tells this story, but I also have an appendix at the back that has a couple of articles. It has that article that you and I talked about, which was the anarchist C&T FAI defense cadre operating concept.
Right.
There's also an article about how the Carlist Recates, which were a rightist traditionalist group, organized in advance of the war, and I also have both of those articles on my Substack. I have some Spanish military terminology and information about ranks because I don't want to constantly interrupt the flow of the story. I have kind of an author's note that's a high-level overview of the timeline of the war. There's some campaign maps. I have a big bibliography because I read an absolute ton of material, and a lot of it in Spanish, that I both read because I can read Spanish okay, as well as using online software, translation software, which is really helpful just to expand what we have access to, because the English language material on this war is extremely limited, and there's a lot of big information that I'm able to bring into the story to play out as part of the narrative, and in these articles.
Yeah, that English language stuff is heavily
helps.
Biased as well. So
Absolutely, yeah. And it's interesting because there was a bunch of work that was done in the 60s that's pretty good. And that was when, Franco was still in the saddle.
Right.
And so you get a lot of really interesting stuff. And one of the things I would say is a lot of the numbers have gotten more accurate as far as because kind of their truth and reconciliation that they did in Spain, like a lot of it was investigating, mass graves and battle sites and records. And a huge part of that has come back and said, oh, well, you know what? Shock of shocks, the leftists were wildly exaggerating all these scenarios. Or it was like, these are combat deaths. There's 13 military-aged men that are buried in this mass grave. Like, they didn't go and slaughter a village or whatever. So there's all kinds of situations like that. But in general, that's also because the libtards totally own Spanish academia now. There's a lot of huge bias. So you can say, well, the anarchists slaughtered 10,000 priests, nuns, and destroyed a third of the churches in Spain in like a 3-month period. And that's really unfortunate. And they were very rogue, but did you remember that Francisco Franco had X number of people executed after the war? And it's yeah, those are the people who did the shit that you just talked about.
Right, so. Exactly. Oh, well, don't bring that up. Let's not talk about that part of it.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I know.
The rule of equivalency here,
And then the other thing, too, is that if you read a really dry history of these subjects, even with that bias weighting, you'll still generally get a picture of of the scenarios and what really happened if you bring your own knowledge to it, right? So here's an example. The elections. So the timeline of Spain is crazy. Like, we all know Spain, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but that was also the time that they finally kicked the Moors out. And they also expelled the non-Christians, we can say, or compelled conversion. And a lot of those people went to the New World, or just dispersed around the Mediterranean in general, right? And so then Spain had this big heat sink, where they're, after centuries of war, of the Reconquista, to retake the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. They then sent that energy out into the rest of the world, conquering the New World. They built a huge empire, became very wealthy, and very, very powerful in Europe. So, the Spanish campaigns in Europe and, Belgium, what became Belgium, Flanders, yada, yada. Yep. Very interesting stuff. And that's a long time ago. And then that all starts as we see, like, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Those, liberal ideas start trying to penetrate Spain. And that's where a lot of the kind of foundational differences start to resurface in terms of, like, the factions that end up not really fighting it out until 1936. And so the 19th century consists of, Napoleon's army invades Spain. They impose a French king. There's all kinds of struggles. The British come in and get involved. All these different regional groups assert themselves, rise up, etc. And so you start seeing military, like domestic military competence in Spain. And these people say, hey, I like this. I like this sort of independence. And so we're going to keep doing it, because during the expansionary period and the colonial period in Spain, like, the general rule was, there was a funnel of money and people into this mission, right? And it would also flow up to the sovereign, and therefore people were given a bit of independence, right? The different regions could kind of semi-self-govern so long as they were on the same page. They could use their own languages. They could use their old legal structures, etc. Right. And kind of where you were in Spain were different traditions. So very broadly, in the north, it had always been Christian, even when they were kind of in some places under the whip hand of the Moors. They had a kind of reciprocal government charters, a lot like the Magna Carta, where different classes had rights and privileges and responsibilities. And then they had a complex network, including the church, for kind of resolving these situations between each other. It wasn't like you go just to a court. Like, you could make appeals within your group, right? So individuals were not stuck representing themselves. They had the support of a group. Mm-hmm. And so that was a deal that in the North they really liked. And so when the libtards came around the time of, the French Revolution and the French Republic, we think as Americans, Republican government, you vote, you choose, self-governance, checks and balances, etc. And in a lot of parts of Spain, they said, wait, that's a worse deal than we have now.
Right.
Because what you're doing is you're stripping away this support structure that I have. And here's the other thing. it was hugely atheist. People forget that the French Revolution was wildly anti-clerical, and it was extremely anti-Christian. And so any groups that tried to retain their religion, you had, what is it, the Vendée, where the French Republican army went in there and basically slaughtered everybody. So the Spanish see all this playing out, and they're like, we don't want that. And so there's a legitimacy, succession legitimacy crisis where a king dies, and instead of the son taking over, the daughter takes over, because of like a little rule that was changed. And also she is under the control of the libtards. And so the libtards, using this, try to move towards kind of constitutional monarchy and, developing a parliament and all this stuff. And the traditionalists aren't having it. So you have three separate, what they call Carlist wars.
Carlist wars, yeah. I'm familiar with the term, yeah.
Yep. And so here's something that's really important to understand, and I do my best to express it in the book. But when you read about it, and as an Anglosphere, Westerner, you're like, how do I understand this idea? And it's always framed as, oh, well, there's this succession, and they thought this other guy was like the legitimate ruler. That's not what it's really about. They supported Don Carlos and that line because he was a traditionalist, and he wanted to steer Spain back to the traditional way of running these, which was that the regions had a lot of autonomy, that the church was left alone, that they don't try to impose all these foreign ideas, etc. And that's why they supported him. They supported him because he supported them. And so these wars go on during the 19th century. Spain loses their pretty much all of their colonies except for Cuba, until 1898. Right. America fights with them over Cuba and the Philippines, and Spain's empire is just gone. They have a toehold in Northwest Africa, like literally right across the water. It's a 1-hour boat trip. I've taken that boat trip. It's very short. And so they have the one, technically two, sometimes colonies in Northwest Africa, and their military starts modernizing because they stay out of World War I, but they start having a lot of battles in Northwest Africa and what they call the Rif War, and they develop what they call their foreign legions. So they have this old bloated army that's scattered all over Spain. They have like one officer for every 7 enlisted men. It's this whole thing about sinecures and corruption and everything. But they start modernizing their army in the kind of a light infantry paradigm in Northwest Africa, and they get blooded. And the founders of the Foreign Legion, La Légion Española, is Francisco Franco, who reappears during the Civil War and kind of rises to become a leading figure there. All the kind of struggles with liberalism haven't really been settled. And here's something I do want to add. At this point, there are elements on the right, including the Phalange, which are really more of like a third positionist. People will call them fascist, but that really just means like binding together the nation and the classes under like a single authority and vision. They really genuinely wanted to reconcile things that they saw as big problems in the country that really negatively affected the poor. And that includes in the South, in the old Moorish regions, there were still traditions that were in place from the days of the Romans, which was massive farms called latifundia that were basically slave labor situations.
Right.
And so that was one of the biggest things like on the left that they could lean into is, these horrible aristocrats running these huge farms that were so exploitative, and they wanted, quote unquote, land reform around that. Right. And the Phalange and the Carlists actually agreed with that if it was done in a way that they agreed with, like ideologically or morally.
Sure.
Because it was a huge problem and it was very unchristian. And so the other thing is there was rapid urbanization and industrialization, just like in the 19th century everywhere else. And so, a handful of cities were just swarming with people from the provinces and everything, and poverty and exploitation became a huge issue. And that was ripe for exploitation by the Bolsheviks as well as anarchists. And so, with the Bolshevik Revolution, succeeding in Russia and all over Europe, making noise and succeeding in some places in Europe, they really wanted to put the kibosh on that. And the kind of the old royal system, which was teetering on, wasn't doing it. So in 1923, because there were all these convulsions of these supposed Republicans, which were mostly anarchists, communists, socialists, and, there were some kind of what we would consider like centrist liberals, or let's say, mainstream Republicans. Some would say rhinos, but I don't think that's an accurate description. There were some of those people, but most of them were very far left, and they saw elections and a republic as a way of overthrowing the king and bringing in a whole new system, just like the French Revolution. And so this wasn't working out. There was a military coup with the approval of the king, and they 1923 through most of the 20s that tried to really get things under control. Well, ultimately they handed over control back to the king, but the movement to establish a republic, from all these different groups pushing it, and the violence associated with that, which was a really important thing. There was a lot of street violence, and the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera in the 20s was an attempt to ratchet down on that. And ultimately it didn't really succeed. There was too much that needed reconciliation. So there were semi-official, in places approved and other places not approved, like local elections, which they had for a while, where the energy from and the success of the pro-Republican parties was such that the king abdicated and left Spain. And so they proclaimed the Second Spanish Republic. And immediately, all the different factions started organizing for war against each other, because they were trying to get control of the state, so that they could then impose their attitudes. The a lot of these so-called Republican groups, like anarchists and such, never really believed in a republic, but they were like, well, we got what we wanted. Now we have room to operate. And they started preparing for an actual anarchist revolution.
Right.
The communists started preparing for a communist revolution. The right-wingers started preparing for a restoration. And so all these people spend all this time preparing for war, some much more effectively than others, all the while the communists are networking with the Soviets and getting their assistance and their promises to support them militarily, whether it's with equipment, as well as quote unquote advisors or actual fighters. And the anarchists start stockpiling their artisanal grenades and building these out. And the story behind that is really interesting. The original fabricators in both South America and Barcelona blew themselves up with their grenades. So the Phi bomb, as George Orwell describes it, is their creation. It's a fragmentation grenade with an impact fuse.
Wow.
And it's really big. It's like 2.5 pounds. And it was just hellish in urban combat, but it was very dangerous for the user as well. So I found some information about that some Spanish autists identified and tracked down in some anarchist memoirs. And I think it's pretty much the first time it's talked about in the English language in my material. So I'm pretty excited about that. So I wrap up the appendix with an article about commercial and artisanal hand grenades of the Spanish Civil War. And I bring it right up to the line where it's just a high level overview while directing people to very interesting lawfully legal resources where they can learn more about the subject. And
so maybe some of us have a future in artisanal grenades as like revolutionary hipsters, you know.
Boutique, handcrafted with love by skilled artisans. Yes.
Okay, that was awesome. As I said, next week we will have the conclusion of this interview. That is all we have time for today. Like and subscribe. Come see us over on Gab and the Mothership. Merry Christmas, and I will see you on the next episode.
Songs drown, the rattle of the train, the roaring of the crowd.